Proper female schools in anywhere near in the proximity. So we began this school in March of 1825. We had 20 students and about 4 boarders. So Mr. Tevis, wait, you probably don't know Mr. Tevis, do you? Thank you. Let me begin again. I'm going to start over and talk about, because you don't know Mr. Tevis, let me tell you a little bit more about me. Are you going to be able to see me right there? I made some notes for the occasion, just so that I want to get all of my facts as a school teacher, you know. I was born in Clark County, Kentucky in 1799. My grandparents on both sides were from Virginia. They immigrated into that area of Kentucky. I was told from the time that I was very little, I love this story, that my great uncle was a very good friend of Daniel Boone. They were actually baptized together in a river near our home. I loved Kentucky. My parents loved the wide open and the beauty of Kentucky. And education was very important to my parents, however. They had the opportunity to be well educated over the years and wanted to pass that on to their children. I was the second child and the oldest daughter. I began going to school myself when I was 4 years old. I walked 2 miles to school. I really did. I know you all hear those stories all the time. I really did. My mother would pack little pails of lunches with cakes and little sandwiches for my brother and I, and we would walk miles and miles to school. But before too long, it became apparent that the schools were just not up to our standards. So we moved quite a bit. Eventually, we moved into Paris, Virginia. And then eventually, I went to the Winchester All-Female Academy. As I said, I was 4 years old when I started school. But then by the time I was 7, I was very, very much proficient in French and in learning all that I could to read. I ended up at the Winchester Female Academy. Oh, I loved learning. I loved learning, I loved reading, I loved the inside of the schoolroom, I loved the way that it smelled, I loved the way the pencil felt, I loved everything about school. And so my parents just kept feeding upon that and kept encouraging that. Now, I was a slender and delicate looking child. You're supposed to say you still are. Thank you. But I was very strong and very active. I could climb like a cat, and I could ride a horse with great proficiency and fearlessness. Even the boys did not mess with me. Eventually, we moved to Washington, D.C. in about 1813. My father had secured a very prominent position up there that afforded us many opportunities. We knew senators, we often dined with statesmen. It was nothing to have congressmen in our home, and I attended the inauguration of President Monroe. I learned that it was just nothing to be able to converse and converse well with people of great prominence. I continued my private school education while I was there, and I learned French. I learned to dance. I learned to play several instruments and to sing wonderfully. I just continued to love learning, and my parents kept encouraging that for me and my brothers and sisters. But then I came to a realization along the time let me read it from my book. As I advanced in my years and stepped upon the threshold of womanhood, my mirror plainly told me that, though I was comely and symmetrical, I was not to depend upon my face for fortune. In other words, I could never expect to be a belle on account of my beauty. I decided, therefore, that my attractions must be of the mind. While I read history and travels and biography and general literature, and I learned much of the known world through the eyes of others, I acquired great knowledge of traveling. I'll be reading more from my book as we go on here. I continued to learn, and as I continued to learn, I became very evident to my teachers that I had the proficiency to teach. So I began to have many young children in my charge, and that's when my early teaching began. But along about the 20th year, things changed. My father had been a very generous man, generous to the fault that he was a terrible bookkeeper. Our family, now, my mother and father had several younger children by this point. My father had lost his job and had lost all of our fortune. My mother and I stayed in Washington, D.C. with the younger siblings, but my father, through the very good graces of friends and family, moved to St. Louis to secure a job and would send money home. Well, my journey had come to an unusual turn. While I had still enjoyed learning just to be learning, it was now time for me to secure a job. So I took a teaching position in Whitfield, Virginia. Well, I struggled with that. Again, many of my friends had married and had children by now, and I was an old woman in my 20s and had not yet married, no hopes of a family, and had never really anticipated teaching and making a living at this. But I secured this position and went on through struggling. My life had changed so much, and I didn't know that teaching was best for me. But with the help of God, I succeeded in educating many, many young children. I became very comfortable in this position. After a while, though, soon my father died, and our situations changed again. I knew that I had to do more to take care of my mother and the young children that were still in our family. I had several younger siblings, as I said, so I accepted a job as a governess in Abington, Virginia. Lived it with a couple in an area called the Meadows, Captain and Mrs. Smith. They became the closest of our friends, and they had a darling little girl named Mary, and she was in my charge, and I was to educate her. She was a little difficult at first, but we came to a great understanding. Pretty soon, I got wind that there were neighbors that were coming. People in the surrounding plantations and farms would begin to send their children to me. As I was teaching Mary, I began to teach other children. And therefore, so suddenly I had a whole other classroom of children in the area. Things continued on very, very well for us there. And I became, as I said, very close friends with the Smiths. Now, I didn't really have a very strong church upbringing. But when I became friends with them and lived there, I was introduced to the Methodist faith. Went to several tent meetings and felt his surge inside me and accepted God. And my path then changed dramatically. Came a young preacher named Mr. Julia Tevis. Now, he was a circuit rider. You know who these preachers are. Not that the small churches in the area could not afford full-time ministers, so Mr. Tevis had all the various churches that he would go and serve. Being very good friends with the Smiths, he often stayed with them. I acted like I didn't notice. Let me read the account. So Mr. Tevis had been staying with the family, and there was a morning that he got ready to leave, and he always blessed the family and said a wonderful prayer, and then he walked out of the room to go leave. Almost involuntarily, I walked to the window to watch his receding form as he passed rapidly down the lawn and through the gateway and mounted his horse and quickly disappeared. I was conscious then of a deeper interest in Mrs. Smith's model preacher than I was willing to acknowledge, even to myself. Well, scarce 2 weeks had elapsed when I received a pastoral letter from him, postmarked in Knoxville, Tennessee, requesting a reply to Shelbyville, Kentucky. His family lived here. Not a single expression in his letter evidenced a deeper interest in me that he might have felt and expressed for others of his numerous charge. Well, I readily accepted the opportunity of corresponding with one of those pious advice might aid me in my onward efforts through the new and almost untied path before me. A truly religious friendship imbued with the spirit of the gospel, and it's one of the greatest of earthly blessings. My reply found him at his father's home near Shelbyville. Our correspondence was continued without the slightest allusion to any prospect of a more intimate relationship, though both afterward acknowledged that to an occasional glimpse, somewhat vague, it is true, a more united interest thereafter for time and for eternity. He noticed me. The usual Christmas quarterly meeting brought him back to Abington, but he tarried in town with a brother. And on New Year's Eve, a long letter written closely and with great care was handed me. This contained a plain, matter-of-fact proposal of marriage, but sufficiently tender for a dignified minister of the gospel. He requested my earnest and prayerful consideration of the matter, and previous to a personal interview which he desired might take place on the morrow. Well, early on the first day of January, we quietly talked over the whole subject as we sat in Mrs. Smith's dining room, one on each side of the fireplace. We were not young enough for romance. I mean, he being 32 years of age and I was 24, and we were both just too serious for affection. Thus, after settling some difficulties relating to continued provisions for the comfort and support of my mother and family, all of which were obviated as soon as he presented by the liberal-minded Christian, who cheerfully promised to aid me in all that I might be required to do for them. And an engagement was agreed upon. I didn't write this in my book. I told him the only way I would marry him is that if I could continue to teach. If I could have my own school. We were married. We married on Tuesday, March the 9th, 1924. We stayed in the area for a while, just 1824. We decided that we would stay there for a while. Mr. Tevis continued teaching and preaching in various other churches, and I went back to school. But after a while, he then received a call to come to the 4th Avenue Methodist Church in downtown Louisville. And as I said earlier, he had family here. So we were going home. My mother and all of our siblings and all decided to come here to Shelbyville. And our journey took us several days. It was quite interesting because many of the paths that we traveled were those that he had taken through wilderness areas as he was going and preaching in various areas. We stayed with friends and family along the way, and then finally we arrived in Shelbyville. The morning star was shining in a cloudless sky of deepest azure when, after partaking of a hastily prepared breakfast, we bade adieu to our hospitable entertainers and were on our way to Shelbyville. Towards noon, we ascended a gentle little hill, and from whence, at a distance of a mile, we saw Shelbyville. Situated on a broken ridge, embowered in foliage, and washed on every side except the west by a creek, which at that time was a deep stream, appropriately called Cliff Creek. So we're here. This is March. We set up house here in this wonderful home, and our son was born in December of that year, our first son. I loved being a mother. I loved being a homemaker. I loved establishing a home. I loved living in Shelbyville. But I felt still that urge and that desire that something was missing, be it to serve God or to do with my training, but I knew that I wanted to teach. Throughout our married life, we had 7 children. Several died. One was my young daughter, Mary. And I adopted several children that I will talk to you later on about that came through the home as orphans. Many of the children came in here as orphans. But this was our home. And we decided, after a while, that Shelbyville really was a proper place for a school. And we opened the school with 20 students from out in the country and 4 boarders. Now, my goodness, there were some interesting things that took place here, particularly with the boarders, the children. Many of these children had not had, shall we say, the privilege of any hardship. They each had their own personal servants. Many of them could scarcely put on their own socks and shoes. My favorite story is of a young girl. I went up and she would not come down to class, so I went up and I checked on her, and her name was Mary, like my dear daughter Mary. I said, "Mary, what is wrong?" And she was just sobbing and sobbing. And before her on her bed were all these dresses, and she could not choose what to wear because someone had already selected her clothes for her. Rules were very important. I learned quite early that these young women would push the rules at every chance they had. So they had very, very strict rules. When they got up in the morning, they had to clean their rooms. They had to have everything picked up totally, and then they still had chores throughout the school that they had to attend to. I finally had to have house mothers that actually kept the keys to their room because the little girls would always find a way to run back up to their room and get something that they forgot. I finally had to put one of the older students, who I called house mothers, in charge that would lock the door and keep the key in her pocket, and the young ladies could not return until a little bit later. One of the things I could not tolerate were practical jokes. There would be no joking. There would be no playing tricks on one another. It was such a great offense. That was something that I just did not tolerate at all throughout this school. We also began, after a while, because we had so many young people that ended up living here, our school continued to grow year and year, and we could not stand to turn anyone away. We had more and more boarders as time went on, and they stayed here over the weekend, so we had to accommodate them with church classes. I was from the tradition then, after being converted to Methodist. We went to church in the morning on Sunday morning and Sunday evening, so we made sure we had that here. Then I taught Sunday school in addition to my other teaching here, so we made sure that each of these young women had a religious background always. Mr. Tevis was wonderful in helping me to manage in addition to his duties, he managed the school for me, and he helped me. He was always by my side. I'm very proud to announce that over all the years this school maintained was always very self-sufficient, financially sound. We never borrowed money. The church never took money from the church. It was self-sufficient on its own. I'm going to read some more things from my book of life here and my philosophy of my teaching. It's not even uncommon that from that neglect of proper instruction at home, they become vicious before knowing what vice is. Often breathing nothing but luxury and pleasure, living in almost total innocence, and daily acquiring bad habits, they become disorderly and irregular in their conduct and carry evil influences along with them into school instead of receiving them there. On the contrary, in a good school, under the strict supervision of competent teachers, their selfish habits and irregularities may be greatly subdued and sometimes eradicated. Teachers, you all agree with me, right? Yes, yes, of course. Put this down here. Young persons should never be taught to distrust their own judgment and never, ever murmur. They should be accustomed to expect opposition and learn to endure it, for this is a lesson which the world will not fail to furnish, and they will practice it the better for having learned it early. The superiority of a teacher does not consist in making her pupils fear and tremble, but rather in securing their own self-respect. An effectual way to ensure the goodwill of pupils is to keep them interested in their studies. Idleness at any period of life is dangerous to virtue, but more to be dreaded in youth than any other season. Therefore, never let a schoolgirl have time to count flies on the wall of her study room or gaze at surrounding objects. Keep the mental powers active and awake, and never allow them to be without a sufficient sphere of operation within the limits of their capacity. Else they will become headstrong, fickle, vain, self-sufficient, adverse to consideration, intent upon the present moment, regardless of the future, forgetful of the past, and fit subjects for temptation. A well-organized and well-governed school greatly diminishes the trouble of teaching. Cheerfulness, order, industry, and propriety of conduct are essential to the highest interest of school. No disorders of books or desks or leaving seats without liberty. No communications either by whispering or otherwise, except by express permission of the presiding teacher, should be in violation law of the study room. Children love to work, and nothing charms them more than to be made to feel their importance. I love that. Children love to work, and nothing charms them more than to be made to feel their importance. I've often endured a young girl to me by asking her assistance, and many an idle one have I made industrious by finding her something to do for others when she was unwilling to work for herself. Great care will be taken by a good teacher to cultivate the powers of expression and correct pronunciation. A bungling, unintelligible answer should never be received. Under no circumstances ought we to accept the common excuse, I know, but I just can't tell. For if anyone knows, he can tell it, and tell it just as well as he knows it. Prompting should be considered as a punishable offense. In the first place, it prevents that moral courage and independence which gives a pupil self-respect. It encourages idleness, and worse than all of that, the habit of deception. Recitation should always be mingled with explanations. I never could confine myself to a textbook. And with all in my advanced pupils have been in the constant habit of reading selections from standard authors, ancient and modern. Just some of my thoughts. In March of 1875, the halls of this school were alive with a reunion. The 50th anniversary of Science Hill School. My students returned. We had over 300 people. We had a feast. Mr. Tevis and I were honored, and we felt so much appreciation. Many of my students returned. You know, over the years that I taught, not only did I teach the young women, but I taught their children and then their grandchildren. In all, I lost count, but I think I taught over 3,000 children in my career. My book is entitled 60 Years in a Schoolroom. 50 years of that was spent here at Science Hill, and the 10, as I told you, in other pieces of my life. Over the years, I had taught many, many students, and I relished every minute of it. We served this lavish dinner, and then we all went into the chapel for a ceremony, and I was asked to speak, and I will share with you those words as I close. My emotional feelings, combined with my exhausted strength, prevent me from taking each and every one of you by the hand and bidding you farewell. But I take you all to my heart. My life's work was not my choosing. I followed it from a sense of duty until I learned to love it. All has been done with an eye to God's glory, and whatever of good has been accomplished has been of the Lord. My life seems to be slipping fast away, but its purposes are being accomplished by that good and gracious providence which has guided me all along my journey. I regard length of days as a blessing and a desire to live for the sake of those who are left on earth, indulging always the glorious anticipation of reunion with the departed ones, which anticipation gives to this life all its unity, peace, and hope. Thank you for being in my school.